So welcome back. I hope everyone had a great night. And as Melanie said, and Steve talked about yesterday, I hope you were able to stay hydrated throughout the night. So we're excited to have additional information about the inherent risk process. Yesterday during the scoping session, we talked a little bit about inherent risk and how we look at residual risk to determine the focus for the risk areas for each entity. So we've got Patrick Van Gelder, who's the Senior Technical Advisor here at WECC, that will share information regarding the inherent risk process, as well as how we look at the top regional risks to identify the targeted areas that we need to look at with an entity or talk to them about, along with how we actually use that information for monitoring engagement. So please join me in welcoming Patrick Van Gelder.
Thank you. Like Kim said, I'm on the oversight planning team at WECC. We started out, maybe Ruchi can confirm this, as compliance risk analysis, the CRA team. Then we morphed into the risk assessment and mitigation team. Somewhere along the way, we turned into entity risk assessment and registration. And now we're oversight planning. So we kind of have developed along the way, improved what we're doing, and our goal is to provide value to the entities with our compliance oversight planning process and oversight planning reports. So today we're going to continue our discussion that we started in the fall on risk framework. It was provided by Scott Tomaszewski. And this is just a little more in depth on how WECC determines WECC's risk framework is established now. So what we will learn and why it matters. Today we're going to learn WECC's oversight planning inherent risk process, how we collaborate with other WECC teams to determine the entity's performance in certain areas, and how the oversight planning team uses the inherent risk and the entity performance to determine the residual risk. We'll discuss how WECC addresses the top regional risks. And this all matters because understanding and addressing unmitigated entity and regional risks will improve the reliability and security of the Western interconnection. So pretty easy agenda. We're going to look specifically at how the oversight planning team identifies inherent risk that an entity poses to the bulk electric system. We'll discuss considerations for entities' performance with addressing and mitigating risks and how combined with the inherent risks, the risk categories are assessed. And finally, we will discuss how the oversight planning team uses regionally identified risks. So the ERO inherent risk factors. I'm not sure when these were first published. I know back in 2014, 2015 timeframe, I was working in Florida at the Florida Reliability Coordinating Council, and I was a risk engineer there, and our director of compliance came to me and said, hey, can you perform an IRA on this entity for our upcoming audit? And of course I said, sure. And that's all the guidance I had. So I determined what risks I wanted to look at. And some of those did align with what other regions were doing, but over time we need to understand and have a consistent common ground throughout the ERO. So we've identified 18 risk factors that we use to determine an entity's inherent risk. And each inherent risk has specified functional applicability and rating criteria. These typically don't change, but recently, last couple of years, we've added and removed some SIP risk factors. So I think we have 3 SIP risk factors, where before we only had 2. And functional applicability, I think there's a change in the horizon. If you are an RSG only, you could probably look and see that no risk factors apply to you, which means you have no inherent risk in the Western interconnection. Well, we know that's not true, so we're going to adjust the functional applicability to include RSGs. The oversight planning team will use existing data and information to specify the inherent risk level for each risk factor. So we have 90+% of our entities, I think it's high 90s, that we have an inherent risk assessment completed on. So we can use that as a starting point and look at any changes that may have occurred. So for example, if we provided the self-certification for Black Start training and then any responded back not applicable because we no longer have Black Start units, then we can look at that self-certification and say that that risk factor is no longer applicable to them. If we do have a question or concern, if additional or updated information is needed from the entity, the oversight planning team can request that the entity complete a risk factor questionnaire. This will be issued via a line. We've kind of piloted this once, and we're not too sure how we're going to use it going forward. So this is a process in progress. We could ask the entity to respond to a request for information. We could ask the entity to submit a self-report, or I'm sorry, a self-certification for that, where it could be not applicable or do not own. Or we could just call the entity and have a discussion with them, email and have a discussion. So we're going to reach out a lot more often than we used to. So based on the risk levels identified, the oversight planning team will determine the overall risk level for that entity. And we don't expect the risk level for most risk factors to change quickly or that often. So if an entity has a high risk factor, we'll just say if it's a GOGOP and they have a capacitor that they use to help control voltage, they would be rated high in voltage control. That doesn't mean their overall risk to the bulky electric system is going to be high. So we consider those instances differently than if you just have one high risk factor, you're high. That's not necessarily the case. There is a little bit of professional judgment that we still can use. And just because a risk factor changes a level, it may not warrant a change in the oversight planning activities. For example, if you have a balancing authority that has 9,850 megawatts of generation, there we go, I'm still here. If they have 9,850 megawatts of generation in their BA area, they would be assessed of medium inherent risk to the bulky electric system. And that's because they have less than 10,000 megawatts and more than 5,000 megawatts of generating capacity in their footprint. That's based on the risk factor criteria. If they add another 200 megawatts, whether it's their own generation or another facility being added to their BA footprint, and they go up to 10,050 megawatts, their inherent risk level would rise to high based on the criteria. Granted, it's only a 2% change from medium to high, so they may become a high inherent risk entity, but it probably won't impact the scope or tools we use because it's only a 2% change in their total risk. The oversight planning team will provide a draft copy of the inherent risk assessment. It's included in Appendix A of the Compliance Oversight Plan report. We ask that the entities provide us feedback on the stated values and the risk levels. If you have additional information that maybe we have missed to ask, that'd be great to know. We can update our profile for you. Typically, we don't have entities say, hey, you know, we're really a higher risk or we have these additional items. But if there are additional things that we need to consider, please let us know so we can have our profile correct. And like I said, the inherent risk level it's just a starting point. And we don't expect entities' overall risk levels to change. And that starting point was definitely where the entity monitoring team structure to go from high, medium, and low impact entities was used to determine how to segregate the entities out. And that's the intent with that was to make sure we focus on similar risks for each entities, because not all entities have the same risks. So it was just a starting point for them. So now we're going to talk about performance considerations. And to understand an entity's performance in addressing and mitigating risk, the oversight planning team is going to consider additional known data and information. And to ensure we have a good understanding of the entity's performance, we're going to collaborate with other WECC teams. So one we collaborate with is entity monitoring. We seem to spend a lot of time working with our entity monitoring team to understand what they've learned from audit and their unique perspective of the entities. So the entity monitoring team reviews controls during engagements, and they provide their assessment of the design and implementation and effectiveness of the controls observed. And following an audit, I think I don't know where Josh is, but Josh mentioned yesterday that we have a discussion with the audit team following the audit. And we review the work papers prior to this meeting. We review the controls that were assessed, the findings, the positive observations, the areas of concern. And we have a discussion with the audit team to understand more about what we've read and what we've documented. The audit team can also give us their assessment on the quality of the evidence that they observed and the responsiveness to requests for information. So if the entity was giving us poor quality or slow to respond, or they were great in responding to RFIs, or their evidence was structured in a great way that, you know, maybe they didn't get a positive observation for it, but it's something we can use in our assessment of the entity. These are things that we need to know from the audit team. And we're getting much better at our turnovers. So, and yesterday during the scoping discussion, the audit team will coordinate with the entity monitoring team prior to an audit to determine a preliminary scope and audit objective. So our compliance oversight planning process is continuously ongoing. It isn't just one snapshot in time. The report is a snapshot in time, but we're always learning about the entity's processes and whatever information we have at the time, whether it's a self-certification, pre-audit scoping, any other information we can use. So the entity monitoring team helps us with the preliminary scope. They help us with the audit objectives and the audit strategy. We'll also coordinate with enforcement to understand entity performance. We review the circumstances around a potential noncompliance, including the root cause that was identified, the duration of the noncompliance, time to identify the noncompliance, remediation of the noncompliance, and the controls assessed during the mitigation of the noncompliance. So we also consider conditions of the entity's self-logging privileges. Additionally, the oversight planning team will consider enforcement's assessment of any previous, current, or pending mitigation assistance. So WECC's oversight, analysis, and administration team. We get a lot of information that this team produces. It's kind of transparent to to maybe the end result in the compliance oversight plan report, but they provide us a lot of data that's mined throughout WECC databases, and they put them in a format that we can use to analyze and determine entities' performance, compare different things together. It helps us understand various aspects of performance considerations for these entities. And a lot of the initiatives that we're working on to improve our processes, this team is instrumental in coordinating for us and delivering us a product that we can use to make our jobs more efficient. So we have to do less mining of that, more like we're using the work of others. And so very appreciative of their hard work. So the reliability planning and performance analysis team. I've been in the electric industry a long time. I think I've got 14 years in generation and 6 years at a control center, and this is my 11th year in the ERO. And this is without a doubt the most in a compliance role that I have ever worked with the RAPA team. So I think that's great. It's where we should have been all along. I've learned so much from them. You'd think with that much time, you could be an expert in a few things, but we need to lean on the RAPA team a lot more because they are the experts in a lot of things that we're not, such as understanding TADS data and GADS data, MIDAS information, and Teams data. They do a lot of this information analysis already, and we shouldn't have to redo their work because they're the ones that are the experts at it, not us. So we're going to lean on them a lot more to help, or to have them help us understand where specific risks are and maybe some of this information that we're looking at, how we can use this better to have a more accurate profile of the entity's performance. So they're going to help us navigate the data, and it's, like I said, it's the best collaboration I've seen in my 11 years in the ERO, and I think it's a great opportunity for us all. So when the assessment of an entity's compliance and controls indicates that they have strong performance in a certain area, this indicates that there is reasonable assurance that the associated risks are being sufficiently mitigated. If the assessment reveals poor performance, we have less assurance that the entity will be compliant or that the unmitigated risks will lead to a reliable and secure BES. So if we don't have a performance assessment, or we don't have one documented for some reason, this doesn't mean that the risk engineer is going to indicate that the entity had poor performance. We may just indicate that the performance has not been assessed, and based on the inherent risk level, we may need to have that assessed. We may need to look at that at our next opportunity. So the residual risk is determined when the entity's performance is considered with regard to their inherent risk. The stronger the performance in mitigating a specific risk can reduce the residual risk below that of the initial inherent risk level. So if you start out with an inherent risk level of, say, medium, and you have great controls, the residual risk should be less than that medium risk to the bulky electric system. Poor performance or lack of documented performance should not increase that inherent risk level. You can't go from medium to medium high inherent risk level because you had poor performance. or that we don't have documented performance. It may give us an opportunity for an area of focus, both WECC and the entity. WECC has an opportunity to document and review and maybe help those entities with that performance area if needed, or it gives the entity an opportunity to maybe bolster their controls in that area. So demonstrated positive performance. With demonstrated positive performance, that designation occurs when WECC has determined that an entity has strong performance amongst a vast majority of the performance considerations. And that's from the Compliance Oversight Plan FAQ document that was posted a couple of years ago. This does not mean that one positive observation at audit is going to give you demonstrated positive performance, nor will it be granted based on your self-logging privileges automatically. It won't warrant a with demonstrated positive performance designation. A positive observation and self-logging privileges are great aspects that we can look at, and we can use those as inputs to determining demonstrated positive performance, but they will not automatically ensure you of that. So it's got to be a vast majority of the performance considerations. And if an entity is designated as with demonstrated positive performance, it will adjust the oversight strategy category that's seen in Section 3 of the Compliance Oversight Plan report. So we still have to follow the rules of procedure, and even though that oversight strategy category for a smaller BA, TOP, or RC could indicate a target monitoring interval of something greater than 3 years, that does not mean we're going to come see you more than every 3 years. So what we can do is we can have a more focused engagement with the entity. It still has to be an audit every 3 years if they're a BA, TOP, or RC. So the scope could be reduced. We could be interested in just certain aspects of the standards and requirements, looking at controls in just certain areas. Or we could alternate the SIP and O&P audits if necessary. So risk categories. The ERO enterprise has established 13 risk categories, which indicate unmitigated and operational risks based on the entity's inherent risk and its performance related to operational risks. And that is also taken from the Compliance Oversight Plan FAQ document. Each risk category will consider all known performance assessments of the entity. The oversight planning team will describe each applicable risk category with the entity's specific inherent risk that is rated high or medium for the applicable risk factors. We decided not to put the low ones in there because we're trying to focus our compliance oversight plan report on what's the most value to the entity and what are the highest risks. So you're only going to see the high or medium ones in there. All of the risk categories will be listed in Appendix B, and their risk levels will be identified there. Additionally, the risk engineer may include additional specific characteristics that are applicable to that risk category and support the conclusion of the concerns. So this can mean if the risk engineer feels like they need to add the miles of transmission or the number of BES cyber assets or BES cyber systems, that they can include that in there if that supports the conclusion that they're trying to tell for this risk category. So the next thing we're going to do is identify any reliability concerns with this risk category, and such concerns may be associated with the risk elements of the current or in previous compliance monitoring and enforcement program implementation plan. So it's got a great list of standards and ERO-wide areas of focus for concerns and issues that have occurred, a lot of smart people, and put that together. A lot of work goes into the background of that, and that helps us with a starting point for those areas. Locally, items identified in the regional risk register can help identify some concerns for these risk categories, and other emerging or entity-specific concerns identified, such as NERC alerts. FERC orders can tell us that there's concerns in certain areas. Events, we don't want to say EOP4 or OE417 events specifically are going to get you monitored or have a concern in a certain area, but something like the 2011 Southwest blackout or cold weather events can help us focus and understand more localized risks. We may include concerns associated with low-rated inherent risk factors. This is a part of how we want to share information with the entities and tell them what we see are concerns that may not be shared otherwise. So we will include specific instances where WECC has documented the entity's performance with mitigating the associated risks and addressing the identified concerns. So in that risk category narrative, you should see something in there that we have information on that says the entity has done this, they have good controls here, the audit team reviewed these controls at audit and said that they were implemented and effective, something to that respect. The results of the inherent risk with the applied entity performance for each risk category individually will determine the residual risk for that risk category. And the risk engineers will identify standards for monitoring that are applicable to the unmitigated risks. And those standards will be included in Appendix B of the Compliance Oversight Plan report. I've been making a conscious effort to say Compliance Oversight Plan report because that is just one document of our overall compliance oversight planning process for each entity and the Western Interconnection. The specific standards identified in Appendix B do not equate to an audit scope. It's merely a snapshot in time for proposed monitoring, which could include auditing, self-certifications, targeted outreach, or other oversight activities that we may choose to do. I also have a challenge where maybe it's from my auditing days where everything had to be black or white, the term monitoring. Monitoring to me, I want to know what that definition is. What is a monitoring engagement? So I go to the rules of procedure and it has a list of monitoring engagements. I've had to learn that's not what we mean here. Monitoring is any sort of oversight, any sort of outreach that we provide or collaborate with the entities that can be included in our monitoring. And I think that's why the name of our department is no longer associated with CMEP. It's reliability and security oversight, because that oversight includes more than just ROP monitoring tools. But when it comes time to plan an engagement, this list of requirements will be considered as a starting point, as well as any other circumstances that have occurred since the time that list was created. Another challenge we're facing in a line is it only allows us to attach requirements that are currently enforceable. So if I wanted to put EOP 12 in your compliance oversight plan report, I cannot, even though I know I want to look at your entity for it. We may identify EOP 12 in a couple of risk categories, several risk categories that it could be attached to. And you will see WECC will monitor EOP 12, but you won't see it in that appendix because Align currently will not allow us to do that. Some features of Align are intended and we have to work around them, and some features are unintended, and hopefully we can get those changed. The SIP and Operations and Planning Risk Engineers, they'll collaborate together to determine which risk category is the highest. So if you think of a risk category like entity coordination, and a lot of entities can be very siloed in their SIP programs versus their OMP programs, or even in their OMP programs can be very siloed also. We can have different perspectives between SIP and OMP of entity coordination. So we have to have some sort of negotiation and collaboration between the two different disciplines to come up with what is the actual highest risk for this entity. Sometimes it's more spirited than others. Other times it's pretty straightforward. But we want to be aligned in that respect so we can tell the entity that entity coordination is your highest risk and why. Not that entity coordination is everybody's highest risk, but it shows up a lot. So looking at all the unmitigated risks, the risk engineers will collaborate to place these risk categories in descending order from the highest risk to the lowest risk. And we want to include as much information as we can, but we don't want to include information that is not necessary. So if there's nothing included where WECC will monitor something or indicate that they're going to monitor something for a risk category, that risk category will not be included in your compliance oversight plan. We'll still do the work on it, but it hasn't we haven't identified anything that we feel like we need to do anything about. So we won't include that risk category. Regional risks. You guys are quiet this morning. Is it my voice? Did the high altitude kick in? I know Melanie warned us about that with alcohol, so. Saw Jay had a shot glass over there. Feel free to ask questions or yell, I don't care. So as mentioned yesterday, the risk engineers have been assigned entities. And the assignments were based on corporate affiliations and entity types. The entity types, such as wind, solar, conventional generation, municipalities, investor-owned utilities, things like that. And the goal was to give each entity a consistent point of contact with the oversight planning team. It was also to focus our team's experts within those assigned entities and to understand the unique reliability risks associated with the different entity types. So clearly, if we have one risk engineer assigned to mostly solar entities, they could have different concerns than a risk engineer assigned to investor-owned utilities or municipalities or conventional generation. So we want to build that bench strength so they can be focused on what risks are associated with that type, and then we can all learn from that. So the oversight planning team will use that information and provide input to the regional risk register. We also use the regional risk register to identify risks for the Western Interconnection. The goal is to identify the top reliability risks in the Western Interconnection. And we will use those top reliability risks, some of which we provide to the regional risk register and some that we agree with. Hopefully we can at least identify some commonalities there. We're going to use that to develop a Western interconnection oversight plan. So in collaboration, the oversight planning team, entity monitoring, enforcement, reliability planning, performance analysis, registration certification, will take those top regional risks and develop a type of engagement to address the indicated unmitigated risk. And I think the cold weather initiative is a great example of how we should move forward with concerns like that. All these teams got together, identified what they wanted to do and which entities should be involved, which facilities should be included, and how we were going to address those risks. A type of engagement could be an audit, and we know which team is going to be doing that. Could be spot checks, some sort of targeted outreach. It could be a survey or any other types of interactions. So the goal of all this is to provide feedback to the entities on how WECC sees their inherent risk, their performance, their residual risk. So we want to understand and provide feedback individually as entities, but we also want to take all of those concerns that we have and the residual risk that we have and use those as building blocks and aggregate those to what the oversight planning team sees as Western interconnection risks. So we want to add value to the entities, but we also want to make sure that we're focusing on the highest level risks and understanding which entities have those impacts. Is that about 10 minutes, Tom? 15 minutes? 22 minutes?
2 minutes.
Question? Tom, you have a question? No. So, any questions for me?
Hi, Alice Ireland with PCS. If you could go back one slide.
I don't know if I can.
think.
Let me see.
Or no, I'm sorry, to slide 11, I think.
11. There we go.
Yep. So this area of performance, doing air quotes for those online, it still seems a bit fuzzy to me, and I really was hoping you could help shed some light on what is evaluated as quote unquote entity performance. Is it just an evaluation of internal controls specific to the risk, or is it overall compliance program management? Do they have an internal controls program? I mean, what is that?
Yes. It's all of that and more.
Okay.
We struggle sometimes for consistency, yet making things tailored to each individual entity. So we're working within the ERO and within just WECC to come up with more guidance in this area, but this would include transmission data commonly found in TADS or generation data performance found in GADS, things like that. We're going to look at events. We're going to, not an individual event, but how event analysis from the Teams program. We're going to look at misoperations. We've always looked at misoperations, but in a lot of this, we're going to rely on other teams to help us understand that data and what we're looking at. So that's why we said that the RAPA team is instrumental. The newly formed, let me think I can get this right, risk analysis and data analytics. Is that right? Is that close enough? they wanted to call themselves the RAD team, but they added data analytics to it.
I guess for, a lot of the compliance professionals in this room, we're kind of perfectionist and we're
Yep.
competitive, right? And we want that gold star. We want it to say demonstrated positive performance, right? And be in that lower risk category. And so a lot of the things you've just described are out of our control, right? Operations, that's that kind of thing. But the things that are in our control, we'd like to know what those are so we can put more focus on those. So you said that NERC and the regions are working on some more clarity about what that is. What are you thinking we would receive to show us that detail?
I'm not sure at what point that's going to be shown, but I think even with the transmission data, an entity can look at that information and understand outage rates and try to minimize that. Not that they don't already. The generation outage rate, those are just data points that we're looking at and maybe comparing them to peer groups or concerns that we have associated with that. There's so much data there that sometimes it's hard to decipher it all. As far as trying to hit certain metrics, I don't think that's the intent of what we're trying to do, because then we understand you want a gold star, but there's so many performance things that an entity does. We can't say meet these 8 metrics and you'll get your gold star. I don't think it's that simple. Compliance culture is one of them. There's so many things that go into a compliance culture, and it can be different for every entity, every size entity, every geographic location. So those are items that I don't think we'll ever be able to get specific on.
Okay.
But it's everything the entities do that we have documentation of that we're trying to capture.
Okay, thank you. Nope, kind of.
You can hear me now. That was kind of scary. So Alice, one of the other things that we look at is sort of the timeliness, right? We can measure whether or not you're timely on your mitigation plan submittals, your self-certification submittals, also periodic data submittals. So if there are some timeliness issues, we also look at that information.
Okay.
We also take into account from the time the violation starts to when you discover it. That's a performance measure, right? Your remediation rates. All of that information goes into this performance, including the stuff that Patrick talked about.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's helpful, but as we're going through the compliance oversight plan, the goal is really to talk to an entity about those things and identify areas where you're doing really well and also areas for improvement.
Okay, thank you.
Al Slusher from the Western Area Power Administration. I wanted to go back and I wanted to make sure I heard correctly, or maybe I misunderstood it, but you had mentioned something along the lines of how an entity responds to an RFI is looked at from a risk perspective. And maybe I misheard that, or I'm just trying to figure out how does that help, or how does that help determine what risk the entity has on the way they respond to something?
Well, much like Kim just said, if an entity is late on RFIs, if they don't get a hold of us ahead of time saying, hey, we're gathering this data and we're going to get it to you, but if you want it perfect, it's going to take another day, and we may grant an extension in that RFI versus other RFIs that have gone out to some entities with no response and even weeks or months go by. There's a big difference there in the culture of compliance that we can look at as far as that performance consideration. It doesn't change the inherent risk of the entity, but it definitely changes the residual risk. It changes our assurance that these risks are being mitigated if there is less interaction or less responsiveness. And the quality of the information is provided also. I know as an auditor, historically, I've asked for evidence and I've gotten very little information out of it. And maybe it was me asking the wrong question. But if I asked the question exactly the same to a different entity, they could provide me even more than what I asked for. So that's a indication of transparency, and that helps out a lot with our reasonable assurance. Specifically at audit, when we want to look at certain items, there's no way we can find absolute assurance of compliance. So we have to find reasonable assurance of compliance. And that part of that are the controls that we have, so that we can look at. And those controls help us with the reasonable assurance. Is that answer your question or not?
Kim,
So, yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
Al, I think, the goal really on some of the RFIs is we're happy to grant extensions if people ask, but where they're not asking and we have no idea and we have to chase the information, we're probably going to have a conversation to understand what took place, right? It's not going to be an automatic where we're going to ding you on performance because you didn't submit it in a timely fashion, but really understanding what took place is really the goal here so that we understand what you're doing and what additional time you might need to provide the information.
that helps explain it, because the way it came off was kind of odd to me, that how an entity responds to an RFI to determine their risk, and really you should be looking at what that response was and does it show compliance or not. And then the only other thing I don't know if you mentioned it, but I'm sure this is what you guys are doing when you on the slide right now, it says poor performance, right? An entity might have a lot of issues, maybe violations, but if they report those quickly or they inform WECC about it, that I don't think that's poor performance. I think that's a really good, strong compliance program. They might not have enough personnel or time to get everything figured out, but I just want to make sure that's, and I know I've spoke to you about this and I know that's what you guys are doing, but maybe reiterate that for the.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-reporting or even an audit finding is not always going to negatively impact the entity. What we're really interested in is that mitigation plan. Mitigation plan is return to compliance and prevent reoccurrence. That prevent reoccurrence is almost always going to be controls. If there's great controls in there, if the response to the RFIs is sufficient and timely, all of that could actually give us more reasonable assurance that the entity is going to be compliant in the future. So I agree, poor performance does not necessarily equate to you've had PNCs, and PNCs can kind of be a good thing sometimes if the mitigation is good. It's unfortunate, but.
So Al, just another thing on that. We talked a little bit about the number of PNCs. It's not necessarily the number of PNCs, right? If somebody has 100 PNCs over a 5-year period of time, does that mean the interconnection's less risky or more risky as a result of that? And so it's really looking at the detective rates, right? Are you finding it quickly, remediating quickly, that information? And we'll talk through that. But as it says on the slide, demonstrated positive performance is sort of this elusive thing, and it never was intended to be something that somebody would get a gold star for, right? It was really a way for us to use the compliance oversight plan to help inform where we actually needed to deploy resources and gain additional information about how an entity identifies and mitigates risk. And so in a way of being transparent, we started sharing that compliance oversight plan with entities so that they had an understanding of how we were seeing their programs and their performance. As we talked yesterday about a differentiated audit experience, that's really what demonstrated positive performance is about, right? We're using the information that we know about you to tailor how we actually show up and engage with you during our monitoring engagements or outreach. So you're seeing value through DPP in the way that we show up through that differentiated audit experience. And maybe it's not apparent now, but hopefully in the next year or so, you'll start to see a pattern of that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Any from the back, Maylee?
No, not at this time.
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Patrick for walking through the inherent risk process. And now I'll hand it